This week on To the Contrary. First, Hillary Clinton's historic presidential run and the impact of her loss. Then, the women's vote and how white women without college degrees may have given Donald Trump the presidency. Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the historical significance of the Clinton presidential run. The U.S. women's rights movement began in the mid-19th century, tied closely to the anti-slavery movement. The first definitive position on women's equality was taken in 1848 under the leadership of Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, New York. In 1878, suffragist Susan B. Anthony wrote a proposed right-to-vote amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It was approved, and women won the right to vote on a national scale in 1920. Justine Eisenberg was 2 years old then.
One of the first memories that I have of marching in a women's suffrage parade in 1920 in Central Park. So that to know that we had more than 100 years later the opportunity to vote for a woman president, it was a major accomplishment, I felt.
Although she's disappointed by Clinton's loss, she says her supporters should not waste time shedding tears.
We cannot wallow in disappointment. We have to figure out what we're going to do and how we're really going to very consciously develop a movement to elect a woman as president.
An equal rights amendment drafted in 1923 by the National Women's Party remained dormant for 50 years. The ERA was approved by the U.S. House in 1971, then by the Senate in 72. On June 30th, 1982, however, ratification of the ERA fell 3 states short of the 38 needed by that deadline. Later congressional efforts to reintroduce the measure have failed, but continue to this day. Women have made history as presidential and vice presidential candidates, starting with Shirley Chisholm. In 1972, she was the first African American to run for a major party nomination for president and was the first woman to compete for the Democratic Party's nomination. In 1984, Geraldine Ferraro became the first female Democrat to be nominated as vice president. Sarah Palin followed her as the first female Republican nominee for that office in 2008. Women gained 1 seat in the U.S. Senate up to 21 and actually lost a seat this election down to 83 in the U.S. House. Despite her loss, Ellie Smeal of the Feminist Majority Foundation says Hillary Clinton's historic candidacy moved women forward.
She's definitely a part of women's political history. She's the first woman to run for a major party, and she won the popular vote. I thought her concession speech was not only graceful, but it was inspiring. And she spoke right to young women. We can't be discouraged. And I think that she has shattered her share of the glass ceilings. We will shatter this one.
Smeal says the only thing that could move women backward is if Donald Trump stacks the Supreme Court with conservative justices who take away from women the right to choose.
Well, I'm very worried about reproductive rights, that we might lose it. They say they're going to put Scalia's on the court, which would, take away Roe v. Wade. Scalia doesn't believe women have any rights except the right to vote under the Constitution. He said that the Constitution does not ban sex discrimination. One of the ways that they win these campaigns is through deception. And they constantly are saying, he said repeatedly, no one respects women more than I. Well, he better start acting like it. And I tell you, they attack the Violence Against Women Act, they attack education and employment access, there will be even a bigger gender gap. We're not going back.
So, Congresswoman Norton, will history decide that Hillary Clinton's run moved women forward or pushed them backward?
Bonnie, the evidence is already in. Hillary broke that glass ceiling wide open by becoming the first woman in American history to win the popular vote in a presidential campaign.
Absolutely pushed forward, because now we have the image of a woman running and winning the popular vote, but running alone. For the little boys and girls that are out there, it really does set the record straight.
No question that it pushed everything forward. This is the first time we've gotten this far, and it's hard to even overestimate the importance of young boys and girls seeing a woman as a credible candidate for the highest office in the land.
I think it pushed it forward, but I often say that I think we can be very proud of women's professional successes every day, not just Election Day.
Right.
So nobody thinks the fact that she lost might say to some young women, don't even try?
No, not at all.
Oh, I think that very much so.
Yes.
But I think that's a different question. So whether women's political progress was pushed forward, I think that's no question about it. I do worry that when people see the kind of campaign and see what she had to endure and then also see a loss, they might step back and say, you know what, I'm just not going to go for this. We know the evidence suggests that when women perceive that there's widespread sexism and discrimination, they're far less likely to throw their own hats into the ring. And so this time around, I think the narrative, we have to be careful about crafting a narrative that is encouraging young women to keep fighting the fight and not be discouraged by the loss.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, because I wrote something recently about election aversion really does seem to be a girl thing, and that women, and that's why I think that there could be a backlash effect. Women in particular seem to be turned off by the sort of 24/7 news coverage and the fact that there's so much noise in a campaign and that you can't actually have a conversation about the issues. And if there was one real downside to this campaign, is there was a lack of talk about the issues. And so I do worry that if we look back over the next few years, we may see a backlash effect for women.
Yeah, did she get too negative towards the end? I'm talking in terms of how little girls will look at this, because it was the most nasty, gutter-like election I've seen and reading history since 1884, which was a heck of a long time ago. And I wonder, is this the kind of thing that will inspire? And it wasn't her fault, but she certainly reacted to. I mean, Donald Trump was clearly to blame for it.
Well, it wasn't part of her fault too. I mean, both sides were nasty. Both sides were nasty, and we know that they paid.
She started out not nasty, and come on. I mean, whatever you want to say about him, he took this election, race right into the gutter.
He did during the primaries, but
and he did during the general.
Understand, she always intended to make it about him, and by making it about him, she went on the offense very early on because she wanted to be about his character. So she did go negative.
She couldn't help but go negative. All that ammunition on the table against women, against immigrants.
Well, let's not make her be a saint then, because she wasn't.
The point is, no candidate would have left that on the table and had nothing to say or would have been punished for it.
But again, then let's let little boys and girls understand the reality of politics.
But she was using his words. It wasn't coming from her. She was simply telling
people what they said. She wasn't the one who initially called men pigs and slobs and ugly.
That is true.
And or tape was released of her saying, "I'm going to grab him by his you-know-what."
She did choose to make that a centerpiece of her ad campaign, and the good news is it didn't work.
No, that's not good news. So we just went through a presidential election where being a sexist, a racist, an Islamophobe, and a hate monger was not disqualifying. And I think that's what we need to be concerned about, because we've sent a signal to the next generation that you can behave however you want, that you can act the way that you would act on a playground in 7th grade, and that doesn't mean that you're not going to get elected president of the United States.
And the real story is that he is not a sexist or a racist, because he's given women opportunities more than anybody in his.
We have no evidence of that.
And we absolutely do have evidence. I'm sorry, but we do.
I think it's very tempting to sort of focus simply on this election, and I think something that is interesting to point out, because I think for a lot of women, as we see sort of right before our discussion, this really was a significant milestone. They've experienced sort of watching this over decades, and the idea that you would finally see a woman in the White House meant a lot to a lot of people, both on the right and on the left. And I think that's something that we shouldn't sort of brush away, and I know conservatives may be more willing to do that. But I do think it's important to sort of remind those little girls and little boys all the other things that women are doing. And I thought a lot about this on Election Day.
That's true.
When I look at sort of the role models that my children have, I think of one mom who's a genetic researcher, and my oldest daughter just met an Olympic fencer, and they knew judges and lawyers and doctors and surgeons and chefs and so many different things. And I think it's important that we don't put too much weight on this one thing, which I think is important, but that we don't sort of ignore all of the other accomplishments.
Congresswoman Norton, are the Democrats going to, in 2020, are the Democrats going to consider, are they going to run a woman who might possibly win this time, or are they just going to say, hey, forget it, the most qualified woman we had, didn't do it?
Look, the women have a real base of women to choose from, but you're going to see with Trump in power all bunches of men and women wanting to run in 2020.
But let's talk about why white women did end up supporting him, contrary to what the polls said they weren't going to. And it wasn't just the uneducated white women, the dismissive attitude of the Democrats and the media in acting like anybody with a brain that's a woman wouldn't support him. They looked past it and they saw his policies and they saw this is a man that knows how to create jobs. This is a man that has turned his own life around when he's had failures. This is a man that can get things done, and that's been his record. She didn't have that record. So that's in large part jobs and hope for the future was a big part of why a lot of these women went for it.
Well, I do think it's interesting that so many women were able to sort of look beyond his statements. Not everyone was able to, but certainly it suggests that there are a lot of people who are falling through the cracks. There are a lot of people who are hurting and who were looking for change. I'm not sure, if they're going to get the change that they deserve or not.
But what's this business about looking beyond his statements? Excuse me. Since when has anybody run for anything in this country when you're supposed to not believe what they're saying, but look beyond what they're saying and somehow think that they're not at all who they are portraying themselves to be?
Even Alice Paul, who wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, said deeds, not words. That it's important to show through action what you're going to do. His life, he showed what he is able to do. So therefore, yes, his words were bad, but luckily they put on their big girl pants and they decided, nope, we're going to look at what his record has been, that he has been a man of accomplishment. We think he's the guy that's going to be able to create the jobs and turn the economy around.
I think that that's what happened on Election Day. I also think it's a sad state of affairs when we've reached a point in this country where the kinds of things that he said on the campaign trail are acceptable or are at least tolerated by a large chunk of the population.
But what about his record?
Look,
there is no political record.
No. What about his business record?
Well, and that was very much in dispute. He had bankruptcies. I mean, if you want to talk his business record, you better be prepared to talk about a mixed record.
Look at Atlantic City.
Well, if that's what would you like to talk about Atlantic City?
Yes.
Yeah, the promises made by the Democrats in Atlantic City that they didn't come through for any of the casino owners. Everybody down there failed. The entire industry went down. He was out of that industry before the failure.
But
his name was still attached.
Let me just say what the Wall Street Journal reported about him stiffing contractors.
Yes.
The same white women and white men who vote, the carpenters and the subcontractors, stiffing all of them. That he used bank. He himself said what he did was he got huge loans for projects. He declared bankruptcy. He stiffed a ton of people, and this is how he became a successful businessman.
I'm sorry.
He said it himself.
No, he did not.
That's not what most successful business people do in America.
I'm sorry, but when did bankruptcy, when it's a Chapter 11 reorganization, become such a heinous thing? Bankruptcy is there to be able to turn things around. More of those vendors got paid by him having bankruptcy than by declaring Chapter 11 or going out of business. All of this, all of the narrative about his businesses has been so distorted and misportrayed, and hopefully the truth now will come out when there's not a political agenda.
There's a whole, it's much more understandable why white men, working class men, went for Trump than white working class women, and shame on them, or white women generally, because it's not working class women. The reason it's more acceptable is that these white men were promised, I'll give you the America of the 1950s. Right. That is to say, everybody at this table knows that manufacturing jobs in steel and the other manufacturing industries cannot possibly, and particularly coal, cannot possibly come back. They're moving offshore to where they've moved offshore to. So that is the kind of promise that's going to be revealed as a fraud very early on. But you can understand the men who will never have jobs like that. The women can only be excused if you say, well, they were married to the men and therefore they've experienced some of this economic despair as well.
Because I tend to agree with that, and I think though that on Hillary Clinton, and I would be curious to also, sort of Jennifer's obviously done much more research on this, but I think that it's important to recognize that even though this particular election was so nasty, and I know obviously it's the most high profile, I feel very optimistic about women's potential opportunities in the political field because most races aren't like this, right? Most races are at the local level, and people are very open to women.
So it's true. So Danny Hayes and I wrote a book called Women on the Run, where we looked at every congressional election in 2010 and 2014, and we found, similar to what scholars have found before, that when women run for office on both sides of the aisle, they're just as likely to win. They raise similar amounts of money, and at the House level, the kind of media coverage they get looks very similar in terms of volume and substance. However, no one knows that, and that's not how people judge the political terrain. So we also found in these national surveys that when people are asked, do you think women can win elections? Do you think that women can raise money? Do you think the media treat women fairly? That those decisions, that those views, that their public opinion is shaped almost entirely by what they see at the presidential level. And people who thought that Sarah Palin or Hillary Clinton weren't treated well in 2008 also assumed that that trickles down. And that's why I'm so discouraged about the discourse that we just saw and sexism on the campaign trail.
Now, what about Secretary Clinton herself? I mean, she was clearly a flawed candidate. Should she have run? Will history say that she should have run, or she should have stepped aside and let somebody like Kirsten Gillibrand run, who didn't have the mountains of baggage.
She had more experience than any candidate has ever had. She was more qualified.
No, I'm not talking about
than any candidate has
I'm talking about the
But
downside.
that's the trade-off.
And the Clinton Foundation, all the ties to donations from the Saudis.
But there are trade-offs involved. No one candidate is ever going to be perfect. And I think Hillary Clinton's emergence as a candidate was amazing. Yes, there were some downsides, but any of the other women that we're naming or any of the other candidates that we're thinking about have different downsides. And it's not fair, I don't think, to hold a female candidate to the expectation that they're only going to have check marks in the plus column and none in the minus.
And Bonnie, since it's once again a 4-to-1, let me step in and defend Donald Trump more accurately.
Well, but 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats.
Right, but it's still 4-to-1. And so the bottom line with Trump is, I hope now that the true narrative will come forward. They don't talk about all the successes. They don't talk about the fact that he hires more women than men as executives. He pays them equally, and Hillary didn't even have a history of equal pay in her enterprise except for her campaign. She paid him 28% less in the Senate and 38% less on the foundation staff. He has a record of actually showing true respect by what he does for the women that work for him, and that has been totally covered up.
Well, we'll get to this in the next segment, but it'll be interesting to see if he stays with that with the appointments in the administration.
It all focused on just the casino business where there were bankruptcies. None of his other businesses were. So, I mean, it is just a real distortion. And yes, there was a lot of...
I just want to quote, just a few weeks ago, he came out and said, yes, that's how I made money. I borrowed huge amounts, footnote, probably more than he knew the properties were worth, but what he was able to get away with borrowing. He declared bankruptcy, footnote, and stiffed a whole lot of subcontractors in the process. And he's not a normal businessman.
He paid a whole lot, and that's what was going on in that industry at the time. As you know, he was a client of mine. Always treated respectfully, always paid all his bills 100% on time with everybody that we dealt with.
People are complicated. Nobody is all good or all bad, generally speaking. But I think
one industry there was a problem.
Certainly, one thing that we also saw
we got to get out. I'm sorry. We have very little time for the next segment. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnier Bay. From the significance of Clinton's run to women voters. President-elect Donald Trump and his family visited the White House late this week to launch what many hoped would be a peaceful transition, but the streets in cities across the country were filled with angry anti-Trump protesters. And pollsters are wondering how they got it wrong by A, not predicting a Trump victory, or B, that white women especially would not support Hillary Clinton to become the first female U.S. president. Clinton did win women overall, but 53% of white women voted for Trump, especially those without college degrees. Paige Gardner of the Voter Participation Center.
These women are struggling. They have struggled for a very, very long time. They don't want to go back to the days of blatant sex discrimination, but they do want change. There's a difference between having heard language like that, which all of us have, and accepting language like that, which many of us don't. But even if you don't accept it, they knew that about him, and they got beyond it because there were other more pressing matters to them in terms of their lives. That gives you a sense of sort of the conflict, I think, in terms of the choices that these women face. In addition to that, I just don't think, unfortunately, her message really broke through to them.
This led the New York Daily News to suggest America should blame white women for Clinton's loss. 51% of white women with college degrees, 94% of black women, and 68% of Latinos chose Clinton, who did win the popular vote. Some doubt less educated white women could be pulled into the Democratic fold, but Gardner disagrees.
If Democrats have a strong economic message and a strong message that is inclusive, they can get these women of color, white working class women. They want to be able to support themselves, to support their families, and they want an America they can believe in again.
Very brief responses to this question because we don't have much time, but yeah, I want to get each of you in about a minute. The Democrats believe they could pull those women in with messages about jobs. On the other hand, his flagship issue was immigration, and these were white women and men who voted for him. Immigration was his main pull, yes or no?
Immigration launched the campaign, but that wasn't the main pull. It really was about him being a job creator. And you heard that echoed back from the women. And they would talk about it, that they believed that he was the guy that could get the jobs not only for them and for their husbands, but for their children.
Briefly, Congresswoman.
Well, the economic message is interesting because he borrowed much of that message from the Democrats. He's talking infrastructure. He's talking spending money. Just try that out on my colleagues in the House and the Senate.
Free trade.
Only initially.
Your thoughts, Sabrina?
Well, it's interesting because after she was nominated, there was actually not that much enthusiasm around Hillary Clinton. I thought that was kind of interesting. There's much more enthusiasm sort of in the aftermath now. And I thought maybe it had to do a little bit with a message that didn't really resonate. It was a little bit out of date, right? That she was sort of talking about shattering the glass ceiling, and it felt a little free to be you and me when women are already doing things. And so I'm wondering if people sort of just ignored that and then they focus on their economic hardships.
Look, I think at the end of the day, this election didn't look that different than a lot of elections. It differed from expectations, but in every presidential election since 1980, women overall have been more likely to go for the Democratic candidate, and we saw that this time around. The gender gap was larger than it was in the previous two elections. It just wasn't the size that we expected it to be, I think in part because of that economic message, especially in the Rust Belt, and in part because the Clinton campaign, in terms of reaching the Obama coalition, turned them out at a little bit lower levels of support and also with a little bit lower in terms of their actual numbers. So, all of those factors together led to a recipe for a Trump win.
Moving forward, are we going to see 50% women appointees in the Trump administration?
Well, we'll certainly try to work towards that, but I think more than
Will
that,
we
you're
see
gonna
it, though? Do you think you have a chance of getting it?
I think that the willingness is there, so we'll see. But as I've said before, Ivanka is going to be a real advocate for women, and she has some definite ideas she wants to help her father put in play.
Quickly.
He needs to move forward with as many women as he can find, given what the kind of campaign he ran.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's going to be a lot of rebuilding to be done. And I think it's possible. Look, I think Republicans actually made a big difference during the midterms, so this is going to be.
Jennifer.
I think it would be a shame if this is the first net setback we see in terms of women in a cabinet.
And very briefly, Supreme Court appointment. Are women going to lose the right to choose? He certainly has promised that they will.
Right. They'd have to have at least 3 appointments before that would be the case. You've got a 6-3 court really right now. Well, you don't have. You have a 6.
I think it's 5-4 actually.
5-3
with Kennedy being the Supreme Court. But in any event, we'll get to that next week with you, Ann. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next time.